Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Homestead. As you can see, today's topic is exploration and conquest. Now, as always, before we begin, hit pause on this video, jot down that lecture outline to the right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. You got it? Good. Now, this is a topic that most students are quite familiar with, right? This is exploration. This is, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And if you were someone who took an advanced world history course or paid a lot of attention in a world history course, this should be a very familiar topic to you. But there are some important, changes. And again, this is going to be what I hate the most, but a very Eurocentric view of this. Now, that's not to say I'm not going to excoriate them and rake them over the coals because of, problems and effects. But this is going to be a very look at specifically Europe and how they went about conquest. Now, so we're going to start at the very likely place, China, because, that's where you should start at, right? Well, of course, the issue is that we too often get this idea that, Europe was the big explorers. You may remember Admiral Zheng He of China, and despite the fact that the dynasty in China that he's living in is quite isolationist, the emperor at the time would be the one emperor who would promote exploration. And what we see is, you see his picture here of his ship, and just see how advanced the Chinese were when it came to exploration. And again, there is some credence, there is some evidence, some scholars believe, that Admiral He very well might have reached the Pacific coast of the United States, possibly even California. Now, there's not a lot of evidence, a lot of speculation, but again, due to writings, and again, look at the size of this ship. This is a ship that was able to navigate on the high seas. And then compared to that tiny little ship in the front, which of course is Columbus's ship. Yeah, size matters here. Now, it should come as no surprise. Let me move on from the Chinese. I had to throw them a little bone here because, again, this is a very Eurocentric class and it just bothers me. Why do Europeans begin to explore? And of course, there's a lot of reasons, but I would hope before I even change the next, slide, I would hope you can already figure out some of these big reasons. Think about some of the background things here. And guys, this is not in my next slide. It's just, think about this for a minute. You have the late Middle Ages, right? You have the Black Death. You're coming out of this Dark Ages period. You're into the Renaissance here, and you're seeing all this new thought. You're rediscovering the works of antiquity. In addition to that, though, you're also seeing a change of government, right? These new monarchs. And one of the big things was that these new monarchs had a larger treasury in and of themselves. They were not always reliant just, on the nobles. And of course, we saw, starting to see the commercial revolution, right? So all these things are prompting people to suddenly look at things they're looking outward rather than solely inward. During the Middle Ages, it was, you were very focused on the medieval period on yourselves. It's kind of like me and my four no more, right? The old saying. But they were very focused on, these nobles are focused on their territory. Well, once the king begins to expand, they start moving into new territories. They start looking outward rather than inward. And so we start seeing this change. And of course, one of the bigger issues, of course, was the Crusades. Now, the Crusades were a terrible, bloody, awful thing that happened in history. I mean, essentially, it was terrorism. But the Christian Crusades did create a European interest in exploration, because the Crusades helped Europeans to rediscover the Middle East and Asia. And what they found there was, ooh, there's riches there. We want riches. We like gold. And so as these kings began to develop their own private armies, as they began to shore up their own resources, they begin to look outward. And they begin to say, well, how can we better trade and get to these riches of Middle East and Asia? How can we bypass those Muslims in the middle, right? And so, of course, the biggest number one reason for exploration was fame and fortune, right? That's the biggest thing. But in addition to that, kind of underlying causes of that, there was interest, right? There's interest in these consumer goods. Remember the commercial revolution, the repopulation of European territories are allowing and creating a new demand for consumer goods. And in addition, we start seeing all these nation states. Again, we're not to the full nation state country yet we know of as modern day. But that start of nationalism, the idea that we don't just belong to our local locality, our local region. No, no, no. Maybe, just maybe, we belong to something bigger. Maybe perhaps a nation state. Again, birth of nationalism. But there's another side to that besides just that idea that, yay, we're all English. It's that, yay, we're all English, but we're better than the French. And the French are like, no, 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 we're better. No, we're better than the Spanish and better than everyone. And so you start getting this competition then between the kings. And so again, not wanting to go to war. Remember we talked about the English king. He doesn't want to go to war, doesn't have to deal with Parliament. Okay, well, exploration can be more lucrative. You can gain more land ultimately once we discover the Americas. But you can do it and compete on a global world stage against your competitor. So Spain against France, against England, against Portugal. These all compete with each other without actually going to war, theoretically. And of course, then there's a whole search for knowledge of the Renaissance, and this is the awareness of living in the dawn of a new age. And maybe we're bigger than we thought we were, and of course, then we get down to the 3 Gs, of course, God, glory, and gold. Now, again, there's the underlying causes of interest, right, in this new knowledge. There's interest in, expanding in competition. But the bottom line that kind of all leads to ultimately is the 3 Gs, God, glory, and gold. Now, that's all well and good, right? We have the printed book that gives far more accurate information. That's important because now we have accurate text to explore the world. But you can't just go on this notion. Because if you just go on the God, glory, and gold notion, all you get are the Crusades, haphazard failures. However, one of the big things we get in the Renaissance period is this new wave of technology, right? And so you get some new maritime technologies, things like the astrolabe. Again, for charting navigation. You get better maps. Again, these are being not always just hand-drawn, so they're far more accurate from place to place. The sextant, again, for determining distance and direction. And of course, finally, the compass. And of course, the European compass was used magnetic north versus the Chinese compass, which used magnetic south. Both work just fine. And it's the combination of all these things that are going to facilitate sea travel. In addition, advances in astronomy will help charting. Because remember, when you're sailing at night, you need a way to go. Well, using astronomy to use the stars to navigate is extremely important. And so you start seeing these various, technologies. The astrolabe for longitude, for latitude. The, this idea that we have different types of maps. So originally we have the globe in 1492, known as the Martin Behaim invented this globe. So again, the idea that the world's round. The Wasmüller's world map in 1507. We have the Mercator map in 1575. Again, each of these is able to advance with new technology and new information. And then Europe was also able to begin to develop better ships. Things like the Portuguese caravel. around 1450. These are lighter and faster ships than the traditional Spanish galleons. And again, remember, the first place they explore is not the Americas. The first place they begin to explore is, in fact, the west coast of Africa. And the problem was the Spanish galleon, large ships, were too bulky to handle the swift winds of the coast. And these Portuguese caravels were lighter, they were faster, and the were known as the lateen sails. They were able to be turned very quickly and efficiently to maneuver, and they would actually be able to sail into the wind. In addition, we have new weapon technology. We have gunpowder and cannons. Again, this is also an import from China. This provides protection against hostile ships on the high seas. It also will help facilitate the dominion of indigenous peoples when they get there. Not to mention, obviously, the rifle as well when they actually get there. And so what we're going to see is these inventions that are going to facilitate not only the travel, but also the conquering once they actually get there, and the protection while they're on the seas from other competitors. You also get the commercial. You get the commercial aspect, the commercial revolution that's going to provide capital. Remember, those joint stock companies, pooling resource investments, is going to help fund these overseas explorations. And of course, then there's the God part, because, it's got to be thrown in there. There is a desire to convert the pagan peoples of the New World ultimately. And so what we're going to see ushered in, starting in about 1450, is the beginning of exploration. Of course, again, initially it's to the Canary Islands. You see it on the far right of that map. You get to the west coast of Africa. You start testing out how do you get places. And then you start seeing the exploration across the Atlantic. And again, they're always looking for the gold. And what we see here is we're going to begin to move in form that realize that, wow, the world's a lot bigger than we thought it was. Now, Spain goes first. I'm sorry, Portugal goes first, sorry. Wrong peninsular country there. Portugal goes first. And it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, they're the ones that are going to have the caravel, which is the shipbuilding. But realize that they have a lot of motive and a lot of, desire, right? Because first of all, they have the position on the coast because they're the farthest of the peninsular European islands. They stick out furthest into the Atlantic. And so they have the position. And they need to look outward because, remember, they're not surrounded by land like, say, France is. France has got water areas, yes, but they're, in there. And even Italy, they're kind of bound within the Mediterranean Sea. But Portugal sticks so far out there that they need to look out for exploration. They're also, again, they can see that tip of Africa up there. And they're like, ooh, what else is here? It's a bigger place, right? We can get there? And so they have the position. They also have the economic motivation because they realize that because they stick out so far that there's this big continent of Africa, but what's around that? How big is Africa really? Can we get around Africa so we can get to the spice islands and the spice trade rather than having to rely on these Muslim traders? And yes, there's also the religious aspect of their, again, there's this, they seek to find the mythical, what was called the Prester John. He was the Christian king somewhere in the East. And what they wanted to do by doing this, by finding this Christian king, was that they could make an alliance with the Muslims. I'm sorry, make an alliance against the Muslims, sorry. Because remember, they're also dealing with the Muslims within their borders, the Moors. They're in Spain, they're in Portugal. And so they want an ally in the East to help fight against the Muslims. Now, again, it gets started very slowly. Now, you see the first major person that you're supposed to know is Prince Henry the Navigator. And again, he's very early. He's around from 1394 to 1460, and this is 100 years before Columbus, basically. And I dubbed him the armchair captain. And if you're a sports fan, the idea of an armchair quarterback is the person who watches TV and doesn't actually do the job, but seems to know everything, right? Claims to know everything. And the reason I call him that is because he didn't do a lot of exploring himself, but rather he financed numerous expeditions along the West African coast in hopes of finding gold. And in turn, he opens a school. He financed the explorations. He helped to develop technology to promote exploration. And he will, as a leader of it, he will try to create these trading posts along the West African coast. Now, I make fun of him calling the armchair explorer or the armchair captain, but the reality is he is the main guy instrumental in ushering in this new era of European exploration. Because even though he himself is not the name you think about when it comes to discovering new lands, he's financing it. He's got the technology. He's got the school that's training these new captains. And so he plays a very important role, including in the lives of people like Bartholomew Diaz. Diaz, he'll be the first European to round the southern tip of Africa in 1488. And of course, Vasco da Gama, he will build on the Diaz's route, and he will complete an all-water expedition to India just 10 years later in 1498. Again, he brings back these Indian goods, which is going to create a huge demand for these goods back in Europe. Well, why is that important? Because now there's more economic motivation, consumer motivation for exploration. So the work of Prince Henry the Navigator, and then ultimately Diaz and da Gama exploring and getting to India, bringing these goods back is going to usher in this new era of exploration, because now people are like, ooh, these are goods that we want. We can get more quickly. Let's do it. And so now, on the other standpoint, so this is good for Europe, obviously. It's good for Portugal. The downside, though, is that this is a huge blow to Italy. If you look at my map here, the traditional route of the Indian Ocean trade, went through up here and then through the Red Sea, across what is now the, Suez Canal, and then through the Mediterranean Sea into Italy, right? And by going all the way around and circumventing the Mediterranean Sea, this is a huge blow because Italy, Venice, had been this hub of trade for centuries. And as a result, da Gama, he's going to bring back spices that were worth 60 times the cost of the actual voyage. So whatever they paid for this voyage, the cost or the value of the spices he brought back from India were 60 times the value. So screw gold. 60 times the value. Profit here. So awesome, amazing. But again, it's going to really hurt the city-states in Italy. Now, the next person you're supposed to know is Pedro Cabral. And Cabral is going to be the one who will accidentally, much like Columbus, discover Brazil. And this becomes incredibly important in 1500. He's attempting to sail to India by sailing the other way. But when he gets to Brazil, he is going to return with 300,000 pounds of spices from Brazil. Now, the reality is he has no idea where he's at, but he likes the results. And it is finally Amerigo Vespucci who is going to explore Brazil, and it is credited that he is perhaps the first European to actually realize that this is not India. This is not some small island in the Indian Ocean. This is not the Spice Islands. He is the first European, as believed, to realize that he had actually discovered a whole new continent, i.e., a new world. Again, back to my argument from last year, he didn't discover anything. I mean, people already lived there. They knew where they were. They weren't lost. But he is kind of credited as realizing this is not what we thought it was. This is someplace new. And so, of course, ultimately, again, he's not the first to be there. Cabral had already been to South America, but he's the one to realize it. And therefore, ultimately, again, you get the name America based off Amerigo. And so Brazil then becomes Portugal's kind of first major colony in the New World. And so they're going to set up an administrative structure that will be very similar to what we'll talk about with Spain. But what is significant, though, is the racial mixing. Because the reality is very few, comparatively, Portuguese actually go to Brazil. They set up an administrative structure that we'll talk about with Spain as well, where it's a few white people, some of these, explorers, some of these, administrative elites that come from Portugal. And they're the ones that are going to use and utilize the native labor, set up sugarcane plantations to the point where, and then ultimately Brazil will be the largest importer of enslaved people from Africa by the 17th century. And of course, by the 18th century, we're going to have, between 17th and 18th century, we're going to have huge productions of coffee, cotton, and most importantly, of course, and worst for the enslaved individuals, sugar. But what we're going to find here is that we're going to have a significant amount of mixing, which is one of the reasons why, even today in Brazil, there are 11 different noted races of people. And I use the term race lightly here or generically because they have 11 different categories for people. And it's based on various features. So if you are dark skinned but have curly hair and a big nose, you are one distinction. But if you're, dark skinned with straight hair and a big nose, you're another distinction. If you're fair skinned with curly hair, you're one distinction. Where if you're light skinned with straight hair, you're another distinction. Like there are these different variations based on the color of your skin, your nose features, and your hair features. But this is the result of significant racial mixing. That will also be a feature when it comes to, say, Spanish conquest. But something that you want to take note of that we'll talk about a little bit later. It's very different in North America. So that is Portugal. Again, they're first. But ultimately, of course, the biggest, the baddest, the man, the myth, the legend, the genocide harbinger, Christopher Columbus. Don't worry, in October we'll celebrate National Genocide Day. Now, Christopher Columbus, who's seen his statues being pulled down all across the United States this summer, of course, in 1492, he's going to sail the ocean blue. And of course, he's eager for Spain to finance the trip. And finally, Isabel and Ferdinand agree. Why? Because they want to compete with the Portuguese. Now, his first 4 expeditions are going to chart most of the major islands in the Caribbean, and as well as Honduras in Central America. So he has 4 voyages. For the most part, he never actually steps on the mainland. He charts most of the Caribbean islands, and he will step foot on Honduras in Central America. For the most part, he doesn't ever go on the mainland. He never goes to Mexico, never goes to the United States, doesn't go anywhere. But he gets all the credit for some reason. And of course, he actually believes that he's reached the Indies, someplace west of India, so the West Indies. And however, I'll make fun of him all day because, well, that's what I do. However, the reality is his founding of the Americas, the Caribbean, and ultimately Honduras, is one of the most major turning points in global history, especially in European history and American history. Because what it is a monumental significance. And I'm not saying this is something that he should be praised for, but it ushers in the official era of European exploration and the complete domination of the Americas. So even though he himself, and again, he's going to do plenty of damage, he and his men, when they get to the Caribbean islands. He's going to decimate islands, the indigenous populations. But Comparatively, and again, people lost their lives, yes, but comparatively, the far greater damage was the fact that there's a huge continent that he found that he's able to go tell Europeans about. It's going to lead to complete domination, destruction, and annihilation, genocide. Because he opens the floodgates for European exploration. And so after him, we'll have Bartolomé de las Casas, who is going to begin to explore. And of course, he's the one who will, let me go back to this slide real quick. Bartolomé de las Casas, he's a priest, he's a former conquistador, whose father had accompanied Columbus on his second voyage. So Bartholomew de las Casas, he's a priest, he's a former conquistador, but his father had accompanied Columbus on his second voyage. And in 1542, he's going to write what he was called a brief account of the destruction of the Indies. And in this book, he publicly criticizes the ruthlessness with which Columbus and his successors treat the Amerindians, the indigenous peoples. In addition, his writings help spread the quote-unquote black legend that became a very prominent idea in Protestant countries. That Spain was being accused of using Christianity ostensibly for killing countless natives. So there became this thing called the Black Legend, that basically Protestant nations like ultimately ultimately England, would use as a method of saying, well, we treat indigenous people great because we're Protestants. Those Catholics are evil. They're using God's name to commit genocide and kill Native Americans. And they're not wrong as far as the Catholics killing Native Americans, but they were doing just as bad. They were just as guilty of genocide, of decimating Amerindian populations. Nonetheless, Columbus's quote-unquote discovery, along with the discovery of Brazil, leads to some problems between Spain and Portugal. Both saying, no, this is my land, this is mine. And of course, you realize, at this point, no one really knows just how big the American continent is, right? They have no idea yet how wide, how vast, how deep, how high. They have no idea. But so in 1494, just 2 years after Columbus sails the ocean blue, Spain wants to secure the dominion and domination of these new territories. And so with the help of the Pope, specifically Pope Leo V, the Pope is going to grant what is known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. And the Treaty of Tordesillas basically was an attempt by Spain to monopolize the New World, even though they themselves have no idea how big it is. And so basically what it is, it put a big line right down the middle of the globe in the Atlantic Ocean, which ostensibly gave Portugal the right to the eastern part of Brazil. So Portugal gets to keep Brazil because they discovered that, right? And everything else in the Americas belongs to Spain. So you might think for a minute, well, Spain got the better of the deal. Well, yeah, they got the land, which possibly the gold. But what Portugal got to keep was the Indian Ocean trade that they're going to dominate for the foreseeable future. And they're going to get the slave trade. And this becomes, again, where both sides are able to deal with this. So Portugal gets exclusive rights to the asiento, the African slave trade. And they get to keep Brazil. And well, basically Spain gets the rest of the Americas. And so after the Treaty of Tordesillas, we see the ushering in now. It's a free-for-all for explorers. Let's go explore. Let's go get at it. And so what we have here is a number of important explorers, including Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who will discover the Pacific Ocean, because he will actually cross the Isthmus of Panama, which, of course, as we all know, is the most narrow part of the Americas, so they can cross from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And Balboa is the first to do so. In addition, Ferdinand Magellan, of course, he is the first to circumnavigate the globe, which is big. This is huge because in doing so, he's able to chart just how vast this ocean is. And so we get the first real good picture. You see the kind of map as a result. Of course, he severely underestimates the size of the United States and Canada. But again, understanding just how big this land really is. And so ultimately, we get this situation. Now, back to Portugal for a minute, because we'll get this back to the conquering part in a minute. Because so we're going to transition now from the exploration to the actual administration and conquering. And what we find is Portugal never tried to conquer lands. Now, they had colonies, right? They have Brazil. But they don't try to conquer lands. Instead, they embrace what's known as the old imperialism. And so what they try to do, this is, if you remember U.S. history from last year, what the Dutch did as well, they established trading posts. And their job is not to conquer new territories, but rather establish trading posts and control the trade. So by 1495, they have established forts and posts all along the Guinea coast. They have penetrated inland to the Mali capital of Timbuktu in West Africa. And Da Gama and also later on Albuquerque are going to set up trading posts throughout India. And so Albuquerque, you see there the name there, Alfonso Albuquerque, is going to lay the foundation for this Portuguese imperialism. No, this is the old imperialism. Their job is to take control of ports, coastal regions that have been won from the Muslims, and create a base in the Indian Ocean. They do not seek to create an empire by expanding inland. They merely want to control the Indian Ocean trade. And sure enough, they do. And ultimately, Alfonso Albuquerque will become the governor of India because so much power rests on the coast. Now, second person you should know about this, again, this is not just explorers, but actually administrators in the area, is Francis Xavier. He's a Jesuit missionary to Asia, who by the 1550s, thousands of natives will be converted to Christianity in India, Indonesia, and Japan. Now, what does this actually mean, though, in the long-term impact? Well, Portugal's trading post empire has some far-reaching legacies and consequences. Number one, it ends the Venetian and Muslim monopoly on the trade. Again, they're able to circumvent both the Muslims and Italy. The Silk Road is going to be diminished as a trading route because now overseas is quicker, more efficient, and often safer. The center of the European trade has now shifted away from the Mediterranean and now moved to the Atlantic Ocean. And finally, the decline of the Hanseatic League. So while the Hanseatic League is vital to coming out of the Middle Ages, it's vital to the commercial revolution, ultimately, this new exploration they help create is going to lead to their downfall. So that's Portugal's side. Remember, they get everything to the east. And yes, they're going to be heavily involved in the slave trade. What about Spain? Because Spain is going to enter the golden age of Spain. And what made the Spanish so different from the Portuguese? Well, they created what was known as the new imperialism. So whereas the old imperialism was trading posts, the new imperialism is actually conquering land and taking colonies. And so what we see here is they begin and again, Spain represents what we see later in history, this new imperialism that we think about in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Acquiring colonies, outright conquering entire regions and subjugating their populations. Of course, led by the Spanish conquistadores. And again, you see the requirement here that it is God's mandate that they do this. That they require all these so-called heathen savage people to basically either convert or die. And so this right here is the difference between Spain and Portugal. Portugal was interested in trade. Spain was using the conquistadors, was interested in conquering, finding the goal. And of course, the two most famous of these conquistadores are Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro. Now, Hernan Cortez, of course, is the one who's going to conquer the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. And of course, Hernan Cortez is going to initially, again, the very famous story is that he lands on the Mexican coast. He burns his ships. Remember, he's doing this illegally. He uses the help of local girl Malinche to help navigate and bring up support from various tribes in Mexico, Mesoamerica as it were, to fight against the Aztecs. And of course, once he gets there, he's initially invited in. And yes, initially there was some thought he may have been some god of return, the god of Quetzalcoatl, who's supposed to be the light-skinned god. And of course, he comes in riding on a horse, this new beast they haven't seen before. But that quickly, guys, seriously, that did not last long. Instead, ultimately what happens is through a combination of horsepower, guns, and of course, smallpox. I mean, part of the way they conquered the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan was by throwing dead bodies who had been, contracted smallpox as a way to weaken the Aztecs and more easily conquer them. And you see some of the pictures of how the Aztecs are more easily able to conquer. They're using superior technology. And then we have, so here's the Mexica. The Aztecs are going to surrender to Hernan Cortez and ultimately usher in the Spanish domination of Mexico. And then to the south, not to be outdone, we have Francisco Pizarro, who's going to go down and conquer the Incas down in Peru. And again, initially, there might have been some thought he was welcomed in, but very quickly is going to, again, very similar tactics, using superior, military as far as gunpower, firepower, and then, horses, and then to use disease to conquer the Incas down in Peru. And of course, what's going to happen as a result is the Spanish Empire becomes 20 times its own size. So the Spanish Empire, at its height, becomes 20 times the size of actual Spain. So by the 1600s, we have this huge empire for the Spanish. And again, using the Recuermento, the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples are forced to either convert or basically die. They must pledge their allegiance, become subject to the Spanish king, someone they have no idea who he is. And the King of Spain grants and governs the American Empire through the Council of the Indies, using viceroys. Now, the viceroy is a local administrator who owes their appointment by the king, and their job is to, administrate. And basically, their job is to extract, right? Their job is to get the god glory and gold. So they're going to convert through missionaries. They're going to get the, so that's the God part. They're going to get the glory because they're conquering new territories and expanding. And of course, they're going to get the gold because there is a lot of gold and silver when it comes to in the Central South America. And so they will be issued the asiento, a license by the Spanish crown that grants merchants a monopoly on these trade routes. And so whereas Portugal got the asiento when it came to the slave trade, the Spanish will get the asiento, these viceroys get the asiento license to grant merchants the monopoly. And as a result, the Spanish are going to divide their empire to force viceroyalties. Again, you need to create administrative staff, right? So they're given a viceroy, and then this large viceroy in America is going to subdivide into 4 sub-viceroyalties. And these 4 smaller royalties are going to create bodies of judges, known as the audiencias. In the audiencias are boards of 12 to 15 judges that will serve as advisor to the viceroy and administrate the empire. Again, that's the technical political part of it, the formation. But what is more important is the economy of this. How do they accomplish their goal of extracting material, extracting wealth? And that comes back, of course, to the mercantilism. The mercantilist policy, economic policy, became the entrenched policy philosophy of the early 16th century onward. In other words, the colonies existed not for development. Colonies existed for the benefit of their mother country. And therefore, the mining of gold and silver was the most important. The crown got 1/5 of all the precious metals, which accounts for more than 25% of the crown's total income. In 1545, the opening of the world's richest silver mines in Potosi in Peru will usher in the golden age of Spain. And so all manufactured goods are shipped to the Americas to discourage native industry. So again, the idea here, like we'll see later in the United States, is that the requirement was all raw products must be shipped back to the mother country to be produced into manufactured goods, to be shipped back across the ocean as completed goods. Why? Because they don't want the locals to be able to develop their own consumer goods, their own manufactured goods. Because to do so would insinuate that they might be independent. They don't need the mother country. And to keep them in an independent relationship where the goal is to extract only, they maintain this mercantilist practice and they make all raw products produce go back to the mother country first. Now, so that's the wealth part, right? So the gold, silver, precious metals. What about the actual like crops, right? How do you grow cash crops like sugarcane? And this comes in the form of the encomienda system. The encomienda system, again, it is similar to the plantation system, but there's some subtle differences. And so the motive here, of course, the Spanish government seeks to reduce the savage exploitation of the American Indians. So there was some saying, well, maybe we're treating the Indians too harshly. Maybe we're killing them is not a good thing here. And so the encomienda system was set up to provide laws and protections against the Amerindians. The reality is, though, those laws against exploitation were poorly enforced, and thus what happens is the Amerindians will work for an owner for a certain number of days per week. But, and this is why it is different than, say, the plantation slavery system. The encomienda system was set up where the Amerindians were required to work on the Spanish-owned land for a certain number of days per week, but they will also have their own parcels of land to work for themselves. And again, this was a way to exploit native labor and forcibly utilize Amerindian labor without fully enslaving them, right? So they're not as bad as, of course, what we're going to find out later on in Brazil and, of course, in the Caribbean and ultimately in the United States. And so while they will import some African enslaved individuals to places like Mexico, comparatively speaking, it's a small number, comparatively speaking. Spain's ability to forcibly utilize Amerindian labor through the encomienda system was a major reason why the Spanish Empire will, comparatively speaking, import fewer enslaved individuals from Africa. But don't misunderstand me here. The encomienda system is brutal. There were laws for protection, they were not enforced, meaning natives were exploited, they were beaten, they were intimidated, and despite the fact it's not technically slavery, they were for all intent and purposes enslaved. Now, what we do see the change on, I think is a big thing. I've always kind of wondered this as a historian. I really wish I had more time to study this topic out, and I will someday. If you think about it, what is a stereotypical Mexican person? Right? They're not Native American, they're not indigenous, Amerindian. They're also not Spanish. What they are is a mestizo. So what happens is a number of Spaniards begin to marry the Amerindians, Amerindian women, obviously, and they begin to procreate children who are both mixed of white Spanish and Native American descent. And again, this is done due to necessity because very few European women actually from Spain actually arrived in the New World during the 16th and 17th century. And so we start seeing is a couple new categories of people in Mexico. And we essentially create a new ethnicity or a new race depending on your perspective. And so in Mexico, there were 4 categories of people. There were natives, Amerindians, the native population. And then that's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is your Spaniards, your pure blood Spaniards who were born in Spain. But then there's 2 groups in the middle. Just above that group as the native population, there was a mestizos. Mestizos are essentially mixed race individuals. They are a mix of white and Native American descent. There was also this other category, though. And you notice I pulled my hands a little closer together for a reason. Because you have on top of the stratum up here, way up here, is, of course, your Spaniards. On the bottom, down here, is your Amerindian native population. Just above that population are your mestizos, your mix of Spanish and Amerindian. But right there, just down from the pure blood Spaniards, is those individuals known as Creoles. The Creoles are those individuals who were Spanish by birth, who were born to 2 pure Spanish parents. So their husband and wife came over from Spain, they procreated, and they had a child. The child, however, was born in the New World, in, say, Mexico. There was a thought process within Spanish society that they were no longer pure Spanish. So you have up there, their parents were up here. Their parents were pure, born in Spain, born in Europe. But they are known as Creoles. Creoles are Spaniards for all intent and purposes, but because they were born in the New World, they are considered tainted, lesser. And of course, ultimately, it is this struggle between not so much the mestizos, but between the Spaniards and the Creoles. Because the Spaniards think they should run everything, but the Creoles become like, wait, no, wait, hold on. We're Spanish, right? We're educated in Spanish language. We're educated in Spanish culture. We were born to Spanish parents. What the heck? And so we're going to see a number of political turmoil caused by this. And even when we get to the Mexican War of Independence, you're going to see this conflict between the mestizos and the Creoles. Of course, they all kind of shun and look down upon the Native American population. And so what we see here is a very different standpoint than make the comparison later to the English occupation of the United States. But again, statistically speaking, relatively few slaves in Mexico, African enslaved individuals, just the encomienda system, and also very few actual Europeans arrive. Again, this is going to be in stark contrast to what happens further north. This is a good place to stop here. We'll come back and finish this lecture in a little bit. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.